Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Live from the Blue Seats. This is producer JL coming at you by himself here on this Sunday evening. We apologize for not getting this episode out during the week. It's been kind of hectic for each and every one of us around this time of the year. First of all, I want to wish Dave well. Dave just had a major operation, but Dave is okay, and we wish him nothing but the best. He's doing all right, still as cranky as ever, although some of the medications that he's been on, it seems as if he's probably a little bit less cranky than he normally is. So, not to say you want to pump him full of drugs, but a medicated Dave is a happy Dave. And a happy Dave is a happy everybody else because we don't have to hear him complain. Anyways, no, Dave's doing all right. He had a procedure done. He's okay, and he'll be back on here soon enough. Rob is doing okay as well. Rob's also very busy as well. The schedule didn't exactly line up too well. I was also really busy as well on my own end, but I finally now have the time to try and get this episode out before the week begins. And yeah, so I figured, we'll just try and get something out. I know you guys have some questions asked. We'll definitely get to those in a sec. But yeah, this is a newer episode for us to sit here and try and pull through. So, as I record this, the Stanley Cup playoffs began. And so Carolina and Ottawa have played their game. Montreal just ended up beating Tampa Bay in overtime 4-3 to take a 1-0 series lead. The Western Conference games are going to happen a little bit later after I record this, and also the incredibly historic 15-year wait for the Buffalo Sabres. And as I record this, they are currently down 1-0. I have a lot of friends in that arena right now, and they're saying it's pretty crazy. But with all that being said, it's the Stanley Cup playoffs, and if you already didn't know by now, or were pretty much hiding under a rock from October until now, the New York Rangers are not in the playoffs. This is the second season in a row that they have failed to make the playoffs. Mike Sullivan's first season as coach was a bit of an up and down one, so to speak. We'll probably get into that a little bit more as we get into the offseason as the Stanley Cup playoffs go through. But the Rangers finished their season off with a 4-2 win against the Tampa Bay Lightning on the Wednesday before recording this. And so there seems to be this sort of weird optimism. And when I say weird, I mean that in a good way. And I know Brandon had just written an article about this on the website, which I definitely agree with him on that regard and what he was saying. But basically, the short of it is that there is a bit of an optimism with this team going forward. There were certain things that were kind of up in the air to start the season. The team was constructed a bit haphazardly coming into the season, but who knows? Maybe that was by design. Who knows? But at the end of the day, though, the team didn't qualify for the playoffs. Obviously, they had that disastrous stretch at the end of December and into January, right before the Olympic break, where they were just not playing well at all. Igor Shesterkin and Adam Fox sustained some pretty bad injuries, so to speak. JT Miller playing hurt this whole season. Vincent Trocheck not playing up to the standard that he should be playing. But ultimately, at the end of the day, though, there seems to be a bit of a turnover in tone. They traded Panarin, which for some reason seemed like it was going to flip a switch. And after the Olympic break, it just kind of seemed like everything clicked to a degree for some reason. And then although Vincent Trocheck was possibly thrown around and dangled to be traded, there was a bit of a different sort of air within the team that wasn't exactly with the club for the first part of the year. Now, there were instances in the first part of the season where the team played hard. They were engaged, they were generating chances, they were playing strong defense, but they were just getting stonewalled for some reason. They just could not score. As evident as of what game 1 was like, as they were only able to beat Buffalo. I think it was 3-0. I was there. And they were solid defensively, but they just couldn't seem to put the puck in the back of the net. And so that kind of seemed to be the common theme going through the season, where they were just kind of there, close but no cigar. And then the injuries started piling up. And then not only did the injuries start piling up and start getting worse, but also the team just kind of seemed frustrated, so to speak. They were playing well on the road. That's kind of what kept them afloat for the first couple of months, was that they were playing well on the road, but at Madison Square Garden was probably one of the worst home performances in a season you could ever see. I think they only won about 9 or 10 games in total. I don't have the number in front of me, unfortunately. I apologize for that, but it was a pretty lackluster performance at Madison Square Garden where they would just not show up at all. They would have games on the road where they would look fantastic, and then the second they step onto the ice at MSG, they were totally a completely different team. So that just kind of, the inconsistency was what really killed them. But I think at the end of the day, though, when you watched a team post-Olympic break, you noticed that there was a bit of an air of optimism, so to speak. Now, obviously, they still have some moves to make, of course. Whether or not they end up trading Vincent Trocheck or Braden Schneider remains to be seen. And of course, you have the restricted free agent market and the unrestricted free agent market, where you could potentially add a forward or two, possibly a defenseman. But I think the big thing that's going to end up really deciding where this team ends up going is what ends up happening with the draft. Now, the Rangers essentially finished with the fourth worst record in the National Hockey League, so that kind of ups their chances to get at least the first overall pick. Now, if they end up getting number one, you immediately go and get a Gavin McKenna. That immediately propels your team and the New York Rangers pretty much to a level that could really put them over the top. Not to say that they're going to compete to be Stanley Cup finalists, but they could really sort of use that boost. And another thing too that Brandon alluded to was that they were not only putting players into positions to succeed, the veterans, but they were really beginning to rely on a lot of the youth that kind of came through. You have Yao Hamelash, you have Adam Sikora. They really began to start to see they really began to see what Gabe Perreault and Mika Zibanejad had. And then obviously, of course, the really big thing here is the emergence of Alexis Lafreniere. Now, some people may not exactly be too encouraged with Lafreniere because he's had similar instances where he's broken out but has never really been able to maintain it. But at least with Lafreniere, it seems a bit different, at least to me. And I could be wrong. We'll have to see what happens once the season starts. And of course, if you already didn't know, the season is going to be 84 games next year, and it's going to start in late September instead of mid-October or early to mid-October, which is kind of nice. Alexis Lafreniere playing on a line with Gabe Perreault and Mika Zibanejad just seemed a lot more comfortable. They traded Artemi Panarin, and the team seemed to play freer. Now, obviously, being out for essentially a month kind of probably played a factor into things. Now, obviously, you don't know. The Olympic season kind of bunches everything together. So when it rains, it pours, so to speak. So it seems like the team needed a bit of a reset. And I think that kind of really helped out their psyches a lot because they ended up coming back and they looked a lot fresher. They looked more engaged. They didn't seem as frustrated. Granted, they were probably already out of the playoffs by then, but it just seemed like a slightly bit of a different team. Especially with the emergence of Hamelash and Laba, or not Laba. Laba plays a part too because he made this. He made the team out of camp, so he looked really good out there, and him playing alongside Sikora and Hamelash, was really something beneficial for this team playing on the fourth line. That kind of gives them really good bottom six options. And of course, the claiming of Ty Cartier, which, at the beginning kind of seemed to be a bit it seemed to be a bit overshadowed by other things, but Ty Cartier ended up really becoming a productive player for this team. He's got a lot of foot speed, and he can get into the corners and do really well in terms of fighting and winning those battles and just doing the job that a really strong bottom six forward can do. So Chris Drury definitely hit it out of the park on that one. Then also, getting Drew Fortescue with his legs under him a little bit, giving him a cup of coffee in the NHL. I've always been kind of a fan of Fortescue, local boy from Long Island. He seems to be a decent skater, decent defender, kind of really smart on the ice. Doesn't really have much of the offensive aspect of the game that you kind of want, but he's still a pretty solid defenseman. Was really good in college, and teammates with Gabe Perreault, so that there's a nice little connection there, and he's gonna definitely be a big part going forward. Obviously, Scott Morrow will probably end up being here at some point. Scott Morrow played pretty well before he was sent down. With the conundrum that is Braden Schneider and Will Borgen, they couldn't really you know, find a spot for Morrow, and they didn't want to play him on his offside, as that's another project that they're trying to do in terms of the defense side of things. But ultimately, at the end of the day, like I said, the team started playing a lot better. They meshed well. They seemed to be more of a compete team. They were playing for each other. Brandon used the word pride in his article. It just seemed more of like a cohesive unit. And it's not to say that Artemi Panarin was the big reason why things were this way, but it's not a coincidence that the Rangers all of a sudden start playing reasonably well when they end up trading Panarin. And obviously, of course, with Carson Soucy back there, not being back there anymore, being traded to the Islanders. It's not to say that Carson Soucy was also, a source of problems, but, they increased a lot of their foot speed. And it's not to say that Carson Soucy was a bad defenseman for the Rangers, because he was actually halfway decent, especially playing with Adam Fox. But at the same time, though, you want to get a bit younger, and Soucy was supposed to be seen as a kind of like a piecemeal guy. If the team were to be successful, that's a guy who can play some pretty decent playoff minutes if he was supposed to play in the playoffs for this team. Um, Huge loss for this team, though, I will say, is Sam Carrick, but the team seemed to really respond well to that, too, with having Laba be the fourth line center with Khmelash and Sikora. You really kind of miss a lot of the glue that Carrick brought in, but it seems as if the Rangers were kind of open on letting some of the younger guys kind of fill in that role. I'm really talking a lot about Khmelash and Sikora, but you really have to see how well they played when they came up here and how they kind of took a foothold on their roster spots and also the trust of Mike Sullivan. Now I know Mike Sullivan said the whole thing about getting bottom six forwards who can do certain things, but at the same time, he's not going to just go out and say, "Yeah, we suck. We need more scoring." He probably have to put it a different way, but beside the point. But that's beside the point. The point is, though, is that this team is definitely in a lot better situation than it was at the end of last season. Now, it may sound like I'm rambling a bit here, but in reality, so much happened between the end of the Olympic break up until now that, it is essentially a tale of two seasons. They started the season off where everything needed to kind of go the right way. Panarin was still kind of producing. The goaltending was awesome. The defense was awesome. They just couldn't score. Mika Zibanejad was beginning to come through, but everything just kind of seemed to not fall into the right place. And then once those losses started compounding, you can really see how it kind of took them over. And then once the Olympic break ended, it just kind of seemed like a team that just wanted to not only play for each other, but just play decent hockey. And some people, will probably get upset that, Gabe Perreault, got a hat trick against the Detroit Red Wings, and that was a big win. And then the next day, Will Cooley got a hat trick, to kind of, not only did he get a hat trick, they buried the Capitals that day. But I think what it is, though, too, is that when you just look at it on the grand scheme of things, granted they did win those games. It didn't change anything about their odds or anything like that for a high traffic, but you want those solid wins because if you're trying to build a new culture, wins like that are crucial. Games like that are crucial. The stretch down the way before the season ended is crucial because you end the season on a high note. This is the second year in a row the team won their final game of the season against the Tampa Bay Lightning, funny enough. But the difference between last season and this season is that this season has a bit of more of an optimism, a spin to it. Last season, when it ended, you just kind of felt like, you were getting put out of your misery. But honestly, and last season, I'm a pretty positive guy if you know me. But last season, we just kind of felt like we had to take the dog out of the shed and shoot it. And I know that's kind of a poor choice of words to say, all things considered, but that's pretty much how that season felt, was that we had to take the dog out of the shed, the rabbit dog, and shoot it. That's how bad that season was. This was not like that. This season was not great by expectations, of course, because this team was expected to play for the playoffs. But at the end of the day, there were some growing pains, and I think that there are certain players that they could rely on now that could really begin to make a difference. Again, I will mention Adam Sikora. I've always been a fan of his. He was somebody that I loved when the Rangers picked because the Rangers and Chris Drury were looking for pretty much high energy guys, and Sikora kind of came off as that. And it's nice that the Rangers finally went down to Hartford and started giving these guys a lot of looks. I know that's a sentiment that I know Hope has mentioned in our chat and also online, but just kind of also shared by everyone in our chat and just, in the space as well, is that you got to give these guys a look. And these young guys gave the team a jolt in the arm, and it kind of really helped things out. And then there was another thing that came out the other day, was right after the Olympic break, there was this sort of kind of, you know, art. It was, I don't want to call it turmoil, but there was a pervasive feeling that Adam Fox was not too thrilled, and rightly so, of course. I mean, you trade Panarin, you put the letter out there, and Vincent Trocheck probably gets dealt, of course, if things were to go a different way. But you're essentially doing a retool, which was, it's not a rebuild, but at the same time, there's going to be a lot of changes going on. And, that was the right call by Drury to do that, of course, although the letter seems a bit misguided. But, Adam Fox seemed as if, his future was up in the question. He's just coming off of the decision that the United States, national team kept him off the roster. And to make matters even worse, to kind of twist the knife into the wound, is they ended up winning gold. So it kind of somewhat validates their decision to do that, even though it's not the right decision. And then, obviously with Sullivan being the coach of Team USA and David Quinn and Chris Drury being a big part of the brain trust as well, you could understand why Adam Fox would feel the way that he did when that piece came out about him potentially being traded. There was also the whole point of the Rangers looking to try and trade for Quinn Hughes. But the Rangers insisted on that, Quinn Hughes was going to be a complementary piece to Fox instead of them trying to replace him, which I do see. But at the end of the day, though, Fox was kind of up in the air, and even though he still seems to be a bit up in the air right now, I think Vince Mercogliano came out with a piece the other day, basically saying that this last stretch of play towards the end of the season was a bit more encouraging in terms of what the future might look like for the team. And honestly, I don't think the Rangers would really trade Adam Fox to begin with. They've got him on a sweetheart deal, and they would, he's just been one of their best players on ice in terms of just advanced metrics and possession and goals for, and just on a power play. I don't think that they're going to do that. They did stress that they need another puck mover, which kind of is a good sign because that means that they do see Adam Fox as part of their plans, which I think is going to be great. So all in all, at the end of the day, while the season didn't end the way that we wanted it, and we're kind of feeling it in terms of not seeing them in the Stanley Cup playoffs, because I sure as heck would, instead of trying to figure out who's going to get the first overall pick between my team and three others, I would rather have put down a $200 deposit on first round Rangers tickets to the playoffs. But we'll just have to wait and see what happens. But this team it's in about, not in a bad way. They're not in a bad rut as many people think they are. They are set up reasonably well enough to get to a point where they could compete next season. And ultimately, you know, that's kind of what we're pretty much just asking for at this point. Try to see if you can get to that point, and then hopefully they can end up building a sustainable contender. We've seen what this franchise can do when they build a sustainable contender. We know that there's a lot of talent on this team still that can push them into a playoff spot. So I'm confident that, they can pull that off. Whether Chris Drury does it or not remains to be seen, but you really can't mess this up. You just really can't. Honestly, you really can't mess it up. They're in a pretty decent position right now where even if they don't get the first or second, whether it's McKenna or Stenberg, they are in a good spot to potentially be relevant next season. And that's all you need. Once you get in, you're in. Doesn't matter if you win the division or not. Just get enough points, get into the dance, and then from there you go on, because you never really know. And then Mike Sullivan's a really good coach in that regard to kind of get his guys to play a bit extra in the playoffs. If you watched any of those Penguins teams from those years, those guys, yeah, granted, they had Sidney Crosby, they had Evgeny Malkin, they had Chris Letang, they even had Marc-Andre Fleury. But from previous coaches will tell you, or at least from what you can see from previous coaches of the Penguins, those three guys alone don't get you into the playoffs. And hoping that Mike Sullivan has the same sort of influence that he had in Pittsburgh when he was coach on roster decisions. And if that's the case, then, even with Chris Drury's shortcomings, if Mike Sullivan is part of the decision making, I trust his decision making more. And I think that will play a lot into what will end up happening with this team. So with that being said, they're in pretty good. They're in a pretty good shape. It sucks the season didn't end the way that we wanted it. Like I said, I'd rather be putting in a deposit and actually maybe probably having been at MSG today because the Knicks played game 1. So either the Rangers would have probably have been either yesterday or today, depending on when the playoff matchup would have been and who they were playing against. So, a year is not that far from here, even though you age a little more and things kind of go through. You have to go through all the holidays and whatever. And if you're like me, you have to watch a crappy baseball team in the Mets all season. So that's going to be a bit of a bummer. But, um, you know, the season is going to start a bit earlier this year, so that's going to be a plus. So, we'll see what happens. But, the Rangers look good. You hope they can carry this momentum over the summer, make some changes, add some to the team, and then uh, hopefully they can come back strong. Cut a bit of the preseason and have yourself a strong start to the season. So that's just me basically talking for 20 minutes about how the season ended. And I basically don't want to sound like I'm rambling, but, I'm sure you guys can definitely understand where we're coming from. All right. So, with that being said, let's go take a look at some of the questions submitted by you guys. First of all, we appreciate and thank you for taking the time out to submit your questions in the first place. So this question comes from dsam1921.bsky.social. And this one says, NYR superlatives. If we were to get a yearbook for the season, what would you choose to have for certain players of your choice on this iteration of the team? So you know what I'm going to do with this one, because I think this is something that I think both Rob and David do pretty well. I'm going to hold off on this question, not because I don't want to answer it, but because I think Rob and Dave will want to give their opinion on also just the team in general about how the season ended or how the season went. But also, I think this would be a good one for them to kind of talk through. So I'm going to keep this here for now, because I think this will be good. And then also, if Dave is still on his meds, of course, from his procedure, and if he wants to do the podcast, then I think it would be kind of funny for him to speak like that, a little bit medicated. So there's that. So we'll hold on to that, DSAM. We thank you so much for submitting your question. So we're going to go into the blog here. And let's see, this is more of a comment than anything. Let me just see. So Nikki70 basically talked about praising Gabe Perreault from his quote on breakup day, and basically just alluding to the fact that he wants to get bigger and put more strength on. And obviously, of course, you can never go wrong with getting, bigger and in the NHL. And then Nikki says, to put aside playing competitive hockey to better himself speaks intelligence. Combined that with his on-ice intelligence, we finally have a homegrown star in the making. That is true. I 100% agree with that. I think Gabe Perreault's next season is going to be a crucial one, in the sense that he's going to really be the difference maker, I think. You're going from Panarin, who is, a guy who would shoot the puck a lot, great passer, but, father time is beginning to catch up to him, to a guy like Gabe Perreault, who was essentially, if you want to really think about it, a younger, probably quicker version of him. And if he can end up putting more weight on him, the thing about Perreault was that he would get knocked off the puck easy. So, it was nice to see him when he came up and stood up here for the final time, was that he was able to fit in well. And obviously with the help of Zibanejad and Lafreniere, they really made his job easy. But as he kept going along, you began to see the confidence in his game, where he was just kind of not as tentative, or, and you could even apply the same thing to Lafreniere too, when Panarin ended up getting traded. And he just seemed comfortable. He became the driver instead of the passenger. And so I think both those guys are comfortable together. And then of course you have Mika Zibanejad, who is going to make the great play, who can wire it in the net for his own self too. And then those two guys, they all help each other out. So I think this is gonna really benefit the Rangers going forward. And I guess there's another comment from Richter 1994. Says, want to know what a leader looks like? Shesty, by far and away the best player on the team, takes blame for this past season. all the Ranger fans want to trade him because the thinking is that the Rangers could get better in front of the goalie is making a big mistake. Unless the Rangers turn to a star-studded, have the puck all the time team like the Avs, and they won't turn into that, then a less than elite goalie is not going to cut it here. Shesty has proven he can play elite goal in New York City. He's the least movable Ranger on the team. The True Ranger Player Award winner, IMO. Shesty gets traded only if he wants out, which appears that he does not want out. That is correct. I also agree with that sentiment as well. Considering that this is going to be a retool, it's not really smart to kind of trade, your franchise goaltender all because you want to improve on other parts of the team. They can still improve on the other parts of the team and still keep Shesterkin. Igor wanted to be here. He signed his contract extension amidst of all the drama. He seems like he's comfortable here. He wants to stay here, and he has every right to stay here. He's for the time he's been here since 2019, basically all he's done is just be the seamless transition goaltender from Henrik Lundqvist. I don't really count Alexander Georgiev. So he's a guy that you have to build around and you can win, and you could probably spend a little money to get better in front of him. The cap's going up, so what's the one thing you should do is just play in front of the guy. Shesty is the rock of this team, and I just never understood why people wanted to go away from that formula, especially people who watch and know what Lundqvist did for this team for 11 years. Oh yeah, but those teams weren't, they weren't great up front. Well, that just kind of adds to the fuel to the fires, so to speak, because not to say that the Rangers can't be that team where they can possess the puck and all that and this net and the fourth, maybe they can, but ultimately, at the end of the day, with the way that this team is currently constructed, and just kind of how Mike Sullivan's going to end up, potentially rostering this team with Chris Drury, you need a guy like that in the back of the net, especially if your defense is prone to leaking chances, So, you want to see a team that is in dire straits that's really not going to go anywhere. There's two examples of this, actually. The only reason why one example is in the playoffs is because of Connor McDavid, the Edmonton Oilers. They have Tristan Jarry, you know. And yeah, granted, they went to 2 cup finals in a row with guys like Stuart Skinner and the like, but, some of those games, maybe Skinner could have pulled one out of his rear end for that possibly. Who knows? Igor can do that for you. Lundqvist did it for us. So why would they want to stray away from that formula if the guy is here? Might as well keep him. So I get that. 100%. Okay, we're going into the next part of the questions. I'm just scrolling through the computer right now. I love you guys comment a lot, so Kara 1940 in one of the comments posted Abraham Simpson and Jasper sitting on the bench laughing and drinking something, which I think is hilarious. Okay, so this question comes from Kerr 1940. Kerr asks, are Drury and Sullivan high or just insane that they believe improving the bottom 6 is the quickest way to nirvana? I think that's sort of a coded response that they had put. They don't want to throw anybody under the bus, so the safest thing to say is that, they want to improve the bottom 6. Clearly, they mentioned the puck moving D, which it's nice that they acknowledge, but, they need somebody to score. They all know that. But I think right now that a lot of this, and even with Chris Drury's press conference, this is all just word salads just to kind of appease the press. They're not going to go out and say, yeah, we can't score for crap, or, I think they got a lot of what they were looking for towards the end of the season. And that's just me. I think it's a lot of just a boilerplate comments just to kind of appease the fan or appease the press. I don't think they 100% believe that just improving the bottom 6 is going to be the way for them to win. Well, I do understand what they were saying to a degree. I think there's a bit more to it than just what they're saying. That just kind of seems to be the thing with Rangers and the management lately, is that they don't really tell us anything. So I'm not going to sit there and dive deep into that, because I think they really know what the issue is. And obviously saying that they need a puck moving D when everybody's been saying it is cool. I just think that they're just saying this just say it. But anyways, next comes from the producer JL praise account. Again, this is not me. I have to reiterate this every single time, just for fun though, of course. But we thank you for not only submitting your question, producer JL praise account, but I thank you for actually believing in me. Nice. Okay, so producer JL Praise Account has 3 questions into one. So I'm gonna read it and then answer it. So this first one is this season sucked, and so did last season. Which was worse? Other than the nonsense with Captain Courageous, this year's team played hard but just wasn't very good. Last year's team seemed to give up at times, so even though the record was better, I'm thinking last year was worse. That is correct. Um, this team just didn't have the drama, which is nice. And it seemed as if management was really trying to mend a lot of bridges at the beginning, which I do kind of understand and appreciate on a fan's point of view. Last season, it was just a bit, it was bad. Chris Drury did not handle it well. The team did not handle it well. Jacob Truba especially did not handle it well. And Peter Laviolette definitely did not handle it well. The whole coaching staff honestly didn't handle it well, and they just kind of could not let it go, so to speak. So this year's team is basically like you said. They played hard, they just weren't very good. And obviously, this year didn't exactly help with JT Miller being hurt, but also with the Olympics kind of shortening the schedule a little bit. So I think what people have to understand, if you don't understand this, if you're listening to this, I highly doubt you don't understand this, but just to say it for those who are listening and don't, is an Olympic season, obviously the schedule is going to get condensed because you're essentially taking off a whole month. And so that doesn't allow for rest in between games. And I don't even think that they even really had that week break that they're usually mandated to have. I think it was probably only a couple of days because of how shortened the season was, or at least how compressed the season was. So if you had games where they were losing really bad, for example, you look at the game against the Penguins on that Saturday game early on in the season where they ended up winning, not by much, but they ended up winning. And then they come back home the next day to play, I want to say it was Washington. And they were just firing on all cylinders and, pressing Charlie Lindgren and the Capitals goaltender. And they just can't seem to get it in the back of the net. And then immediately you have to go and do that again Tuesday. And everything just kind of compounded on each other. But on a regular season, that Tuesday game probably gets pushed to Wednesday or Thursday. So that gives you an extra day to kind of either relax, reset, get back into a groove, evaluate things, and kind of just let it breathe a little bit. And not just with the Rangers. This was happening with a lot of teams this year where teams are just getting hurt and they could never really recover from it. Oh, the other team I was going to mention, I forgot to mention about having a bad goaltender, uh, and would essentially be the New Jersey Devils. They have a bad goaltender. Their goaltending situation is crap. Team's not going to be good. I mean, let's see what the new GM decides to do. But that team wasn't going to go anywhere without a decent goaltender. So it's even more important to have Igor in your corner. But this season was a lot better in terms of that it wasn't a total tire fire off the ice. It kind of seems like it was a lot calmer. The Rangers hired I think it was Blake Wheeler, and I can't remember who else they hired. I am so sorry. We talked about this in the offseason, but they hired a couple of former players to essentially be, you know, uh, kind of liaisons to the team, and I maybe Jonathan Quick ends up getting a similar position. That's another thing we'll have to mention in a bit is Jonathan Quick. But you know, it seems as if the communication has increased a bit more between Drury, Sullivan, and the players. Sullivan is really good at that, uh, and it kind of works out in the way that the team just kind of was able to play hockey. But then with the injuries and everything coming up, and just the team just not being constructed really well, and then Panarin being around, it just kind of fell in its own. That happens. Good teams just don't play well, and this team was not, you know, just not good. So yeah, this season was a lot better. Last season was way worse because they actually gave up on the team and the fans. It was bad. And you still have some of the same characters, or some of the same characters. I'm really pointing at Vincent Trocheck here, Adam Fox to a degree. But those guys can, they bounced back a lot more this year, especially Trocheck to a degree. Wasn't as problematic to a degree. He seemed like he was a bit of a problem last year, but um so that last season was way worse. This season is just because they were bad. So, but hopefully this offseason with some of the young kids that they have now, they can really compound on the youth and also the talent on the skill side of it, and actually expand on it, and they might actually be decent. The second question you ask is, which playoff series are you most looking forward to? The obvious answer is Dallas, Minnesota, but I'm also excited for Tampa, Montreal, and I hope I can stay late enough to watch Edmonton, Anaheim for the boatload of goals. Uh, I'm gonna go on a limb and I'm gonna say Buffalo, Boston. Now, I've mentioned Buffalo on here before. I have a couple of good buddies that live out in Buffalo. I go up there all the time whenever the Rangers play out there or when I get a chance to. And granted, I am a Jets fan, so I'm not a huge fan of the Bills, but outside of that, the city of Buffalo really deserves this. And as I say this, they're down 1-0 going into the third period. The city of Buffalo deserves good playoff hockey, and as long as it's not at the expense of the New York Rangers, I will be more than happy to see them have success. And that's the series I'm going to be looking forward to the most. I think after that, Dallas, Minnesota, it's kind of, yeah, game one wasn't exactly great. Maybe game two might be a bit better. Um, but Tampa Montreal is going to be pretty good just off the fact that Montreal's, a very chippy team, and so is Tampa Bay. But I think the one that I'm going to be looking forward to most is, like I said, Buffalo, Boston, just to see how the city of Buffalo has reacted, which they've already reacted superbly so far. If you go on social media and see how those people are just embracing the fact that they're in is great. But also just kind of, my buddy's sending me all these messages and texts from while he's at the arena right now, and just how loud the place is. It's just, I'm hoping that they can get a decent run throughout the playoffs. So I'm curious to see how the team handles it, at least on the Buffalo side of things when it comes to playing in the playoffs. Because the KeyBank Center is a nice arena. Like, I like KeyBank. It's they're slowly upgrading it, but that building could be really loud. I was there for opening night in 22 during Laviolette's first season, and I think that was right after Rick Jenneret passed away. It was opening night, and that was at full capacity. And granted, even though the Rangers did win, and a lot of Ranger fans do go to Western New York to go see them play, the Buffalo fans are just as passionate as Ranger fans. So um, I'm looking forward to this Buffalo Boston series, seeing how it goes, seeing how the city reacts, and then I guess I'll go from there. And the third one is for Dave, and this is good luck with the recovery, Dave. I had my ACL repaired about 10 years ago, and I was laid on the couch for 2 weeks with my wife waiting on me hand and foot. It was genuinely one of the best times of my life. I'm thinking of tearing the other one. Hope your recovery is as nice. So I'm sure he saw this, but I will pass the good words on to him. Uh, the way that he was kind of putting it to us in our chat was that I think this is the medication talking. He seemed a bit like calm, which is, Dave, that's a bit odd that he's calm. So, and honestly, I think that he might do the same thing that you do or want to do, is tearing your other ACL. So I think he might want to do that, or maybe he is going to get the other one done. I don't know, but um, Docile Dave I called him in a chat one time, Docile Dave. So we'll go with that. This next question comes from LGR. You know what? We're gonna skip that. I don't know exactly who Joe is, so to speak, and I apologize if I'm missing that. Maybe I'll have to potentially revisit that. I don't know. We're going to skip that for now. So my apologies on that. This one comes from Ranger Fan 62, and it says, "Don't get me wrong, Fox is by far our best defenseman and offensively one of the best in the league. My question is, do you think he should be hitting the gym and adding more muscle, and perhaps that could help with the injuries he's had the last couple of seasons?" No, because Fox is not he's not supposed to be big. If you watch him play, he's shifty. I think and I mentioned this before, I think the issue that a lot of us, and I sometimes I get caught up in it, I won't lie. But I think the issue with how we envision Adam Fox is that he's not built like he doesn't do what Cale Makar does. And reason why he doesn't do what Cale Makar does or what Quinn Hughes does is because Adam Fox was never one to be a trailblazing skater. What makes Adam Fox one of the best offensive defensemen in the league is his smarts. He can skate reasonably well. Granted, he has slowed down a bit because of the knee injury. Hopefully next season he can regain a little bit of the speed that he had in his first year and a half as a Ranger. But at the same time, though, even with his injuries, it's never really impeded him. The guy played on one leg in the Stanley Cup playoffs. So I don't think him being big you know, would really do anything. I think it's just his knee just really needs to just recover a little bit more. And that's probably a blessing in disguise with the team not making it to the playoffs, is that maybe he can fully heal and potentially go through an off season to go through a season where he doesn't end up hurting his knee. But everything else, though, he's been fine, and I don't think bulking up or adding more muscle would really help with that. It's just more of a repair sort of thing, whether or not he has, some sort of tear or some sort of, inflammation or something that's causing it to not be the same as it was before. But even if he is in that condition, so to speak, he is healthy enough to play, and he's been fine. He's been nothing but, awesome on the back end. I think what will make it easier for Fox is they need to find another puck mover, kind of get someone to be a puck mover on the second pair. Or maybe if you want to have someone be a puck mover on the third pair, because if you really look at the way that the defense is constructed, it's Adam Fox, Vlad Gavrikov. In automatic, that's your first pair D. But then you go to the second and third D pairs, and you're kind of mixed between Scott Morrow, Braden Schneider, Will Borgen, and Matthew Robertson, to a degree, Urho Vakanainen and Vincent Iorio, not anyone that's going to really be barn burners when it comes to moving the puck around. Maybe Will Borgen has that ability in him, but you need someone who has a little bit more offensive skill, because Borgen, while he can skate, is more of a two-way defenseman. And, you want to talk about defensemen that need to get healthy and not play hurt. He's one of them. He needs to, heal up and hopefully he can stay, healthy for this next season, because when Will Borgen's healthy, Will Borgen is a decent depth defenseman piece. So this next question or this next comment comes from Richter 1994, and it's basically two names that the Rangers could potentially get: Keaton Verhoff, defenseman from North Dakota, and Chase Reed from the Sioux Greyhounds in the OHL are the two D-men associated in mock drafts of the Rangers, both extremely good skaters. And after what the Isles got in their drafted D-man, the Rangers may very well go in this direction. The Rangers need D-men who can get out of their zone, a major problem for them for years. As I said, this would be great. I think Chase Reed is probably a bit more on the upside, but Keaton Verhoff is also just really good too. Depending on when these guys are ready to come and play, I'm going to assume that Chase Reed is probably quicker to make the jump to the NHL than Keaton Verhoff, because usually guys in college tend to stay a little bit longer. But if they can't get McKenna or Stenberg, then you absolutely have to do that. There's no other shot or no other chance that they can probably have that could really improve this team than getting either one of those four guys. Obviously you want it to be on forward a little bit, because then it kind of takes away the reliance of potentially getting someone either on the RFA market, which I'm, still an advocate for getting Jason Robertson, or on the UFA market, which, I'm a little worried that they're going to overpay for Alex Tuch, but at the same time, Tuch is still kind of in the window of them wanting to win, so I wouldn't exactly be against that too much, being that the cap is going up and then McDavid is going to be a free agent after next year. But that's another conversation for another day. But yes, no, I definitely agree with that. Verhoff and Reed are definitely two guys the Rangers can get, and I think they would do pretty well with them. And yes, I think what we underestimated was how good Matthew Schaefer was. I don't think anyone really expected him to do this well. You expected him to do well, and maybe that's just me. But smaller D men usually tend to get beaten up in their first year, and it was really good for them to see Matthew Schaefer really sort of kind of come into his own. Kid's awesome. He's an Islander, but the kid's awesome. I think the Rangers would hope to kind of get that, because I think that would be incredibly dynamic for them to have that on the team if they can't get a guy like Stenberg or McKenna. So this next question comes from NYR Life, NYR for life, excuse me. Already at breakup day today, Drury wouldn't commit to Garand as next year's backup. I think that's too early to tell, although it kind of seems to be obvious now that Garand is going to be the backup next season, especially with Jonathan Quick retiring. There's really nobody else unless they sign a guy, which I don't think they're going to sign a guy, but um, I wouldn't, again, when these guys speak in these, conferences at, pretty much any time, they're really going to just say stuff. So I think Garand's going to be the backup next season. And he's played well enough to be the backup next season. So there's that. This question comes from Spozo, and Spozo asks, who gets the fourth A next season, Lafreniere or Gavrikov? I'm betting on Lafreniere. I'm going to say Gavrikov, unless they sign somebody who is. I think if they end up signing Alex Tuch for some reason, which, I'm kind of 50-50 on, but if they do sign Alex Tuch, I think he probably gets it because he is an alternate captain on the Sabres. But um, more than likely, it's probably going to be Gavrikov. I don't see Lafreniere getting it. I don't know. He just doesn't seem like the kind of guy that would wear an A. So it'd probably be Gavrikov. I'm just trying to think of who else. Cooley could probably get an A. I could see that happening, being that he, has been here for some time and, he's a bit of a rough and tumble player who can lead by example, so to speak. Cooley is definitely an option, but I think if it's between Lafreniere and Gavrikov, it's definitely going to Gavrikov. I don't know how the team would want to feel with having two alternate captains on the same D pair. Not to say that necessarily matters, but I think it's going to be Gavrikov. Although I could see, like I said, a guy like Will Cooley getting it, which I think would be pretty cool. This next question comes from Nikki70, and Nikki70 asks, does Drury put the higher draft pick in play for one of Trocheck or Robertson, assuming we don't get either one of the first two slots? No, I think that if they're going to make a trade with a draft pick, it's going to be the later draft pick. It seems as if they're dead set on keeping number 1 to 4 if that's where they're going to be positioned. It appears to be that 1 to 4 is going to be where they're going to draft. So I don't think that they're going to give that up for anything because, like I said, any guys you can get from 1 to 4 can really be a positive for this team, and I reasonably kind of get that the Rangers will make the right pick, whether it's between McKenna Stenberg or Verhoff and Reed. You just can't miss in that regard. You wish it could be a bit more center heavy because that just kind of seems to always be the issue with this team forever. But at the same time, if those guys are available, you're not going to trade that or say no. I think if they're going to trade, they're going to trade the second first round pick that they have and maybe mix in with maybe a player or two and probably use one of their later round picks if they're really trying to go for like a name, so to speak. So no, they're not. If they're going to trade for a Tkachuk or a Tkachuk or a Robertson, it's going to be the later one. Then again, I don't necessarily think the Senators are going to trade Brady Tkachuk. I think Jason Robertson is more of a realistic option, being that he is an RFA and you can just sign him. But obviously, the draft pick compensation would be different. But also, too, if they do end up signing Jason Robertson for a pretty high amount, the first round pick they'll have to give will start for next season. So you wouldn't have to worry about that. Especially if you're getting a guy like Jason Robertson. I mean, you just kind of have to do that. If the offer is there and they want to sign him for 11 mil or more, maybe 10.5, you make that signing any day of the week if he accepts. Whether or not Dallas ends up deciding to keep it or not or match, that's another story to begin with. But that's even if the Rangers even entertain that. Dave doesn't believe so. I'm not sure what Rob thinks. We'll probably find out at some point. But I think Jason Robertson, the pick would be used for next year, and I don't think that I don't think Brady Tkachuk is going anywhere. Although he would fit really well with what this team is trying to do. It's a skilled player who plays hard, especially after his Olympic showing. So, but I think that I don't think they'll dangle the first over the pick that could be 1 to 4. So, okay, well, you guys are really. I love this. You guys are constantly talking to this in this chat in this thread here, which is great. So, this question comes from Two Line Passes. And Two Line Passes asks, why does being a New York Ranger fan sometimes feel less like supporting a team and more like a joining of medieval order of flagellants, if I'm saying that right? Endlessly enduring cycles of hope, collapse, and self-inflicted emotional pain. And at what point does the suffering stop being loyalty and start becoming something we actually need to question or get medicated for? Thank you, Drew. May I have another? I think I'll have to see if I can remember this question so we can pose it to Rob and Dave. I think they get a kick out of this too. But um, this is kind of very similar to my sentiments of being a New York Mets fan. It's 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 like, why do we do this? I actually, today as we're recording this, the Mets have lost 11 games in a row. Perfect way to start this 2026 season that had so much promise and hope. Which, I mean, anything can still happen, of course, because it's April, but it's not a good sign when your team loses 11 in a row in the first month of the season. But it's a very similar sentiment that I have. I will say though, truthfully though, the Rangers seem to have a bit more hope. At least one of my teams that has hope outside of my other sports fandom. I think we do it because we're just suckers, and I think we live for the pain. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, there really isn't nothing else worth it more than enduring Rangers playoff hockey, even though it's a grind. But I think we actually enjoy it a little bit, you know? We wouldn't not we would be somewhere else if we didn't enjoy it, you know? But I'd like to see what Dave and Rob would have to say about that, but, try to remember, let them know that. That's pretty funny. Um, then again, my therapist definitely has heard me rant about my teams every so often, so I think the New York Rangers are doing pretty well in the, psychologist, department where they don't wanna get put out of business, pretty much is basically what I'm saying. So, all right. So I think that's all the questions we have. We got through pretty much 51 minutes of just me talking, and I'm so sorry ahead of time with that. Um, so I guess just going forward, it'll probably be a bit of the same uh kind of, I guess, schedule, or how we put out content. We're going to keep this podcast going, of course, throughout the summer. Um, Obviously, if we can get Dave and Rob on when we can, we'll be sure to do that. We'll see if we can try and get Hope and Tyler on again. Maybe get Russ to come on. We'll probably try and do some different things, some retrospectives and whatnot, to kind of kill time in between certain parts of the summer that kind of have a lull. But this podcast is going to keep going. We might take a week break here or there, depending on how I'm feeling or how Rob and Dave are feeling. But ultimately, at the end of the day, this podcast is going to be releasing throughout the summer, and we're going to have this podcast go on as long as the summer goes on. So don't have to worry about that. Whether or not we release it, we'll try to release it every Friday as much as we can. But we're definitely going to keep going. It's not the train's not going to stop, and we'll be here for whatever happens in Rangers land or whatever happens big in the NHL. Right now we're in the Stanley Cup playoffs, like I said, and we'll get through the final. We'll go to the draft, free agent frenzy, of course. That's going to be huge. And we'll be here throughout the summer, whether it's going to be me, Rob, Dave, or just myself, or maybe some other of our contributors on the side as well. We are going to be here. And just a quick note on Jonathan Quick before we finish for tonight. Uh, Quickie, for the three seasons that he was here, you know, he was pretty big piece, for the most part, at least for the first year in 22. He was a big part of this team last season when they were still in kind of the hunt. And unfortunately, this year you kind of see the cracks breaking on, the impervious wall that Quickie was. But that first season in 24 was probably a pretty good last hurrah for him. Playing on a team that won the President's Trophy, going to the conference final, being a huge rock for that team, and being an inspiration for not only Matt Rempe, but also, uh, Igor Shesterkin as well. We've always been blessed with having good backups, and it's nice to see that we had Jonathan Quick on our team, and it's kind of like a bit of a recompense after 2014. So, local boy from Connecticut, grew up a Ranger fan. You always love to see it. It was really cool to see him out there as a Ranger, so I'm glad that we got to have that it's similar to other players who didn't start out as Rangers, but they either finished their career as Rangers or had a brief period of time with the Rangers. It's nice to have had them on the team. And I think Quickie embodied that. And, he was good here for a bit. He's not like he was useless. He had that stretch in January of 24, or was it 24? Yeah, January of 24, where he essentially kind of allowed Igor to get his groove back by winning a bunch of those games in a row, especially that Ottawa game that really kind of set the season in motion that year, that kind of put them head and shoulders above everybody else, all things considered. And good luck to Jonathan Quick in retirement and in whatever career endeavors that he may uh, go through. It sucks that his last game ended up in a loss, but he played very well in that game. And even though there are some instances throughout the season where he just didn't seem like he was going to be the guy, he did his best to make sure that he came out and played hard and did what he had to do. Father time has its limits, and when Father time comes calling, you sometimes can't avoid it. And ultimately, that's what happened with Quick. So we wish him nothing but the best of retirement. He was a good Ranger outside of maybe this season, but even so, he was a trooper. He was a good glue guy for the clubhouse. Everyone seemed to like and respect him, and his presence will definitely be missed. So hopefully the Rangers can keep him around in some capacity because it'd be nice. So anyways, so best of luck to Quickie and his retirement. And, Hall of Famer, definitely for sure. Greatest American goaltender of all time. All right. So with that being said, we'll get this up as soon as possible. And we thank you for taking the time out to listen to us, to read our articles. If you're a Patreon subscriber, thank you so much for that. Huge props to Dave and the rest of the crew for not only allowing me to do this, but having this platform for everyone to sit and enjoy and talk Rangers hockey as well. So we'll be back with you hopefully next week with another new episode, hopefully with a little bit more development on the Stanley Cup playoffs there. But we'll keep you in the loop on how this is going to go for the summer, and we'll catch you soon. So with that being said, let's go Rangers, and catch you on the flip side.